Section 4 of T. de Witt Talmage as I Knew Him. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by K. Hand. T. de Witt Talmage as I Knew Him by Thomas de Witt Talmage. Milestone 3. 1856 to 1862. My first sermons were to me the most tremendous endeavors of my life, because I felt the awful responsibility of standing in a pulpit knowing that a great many people would be influenced by what I said concerning God, or the soul, or the great future. When I first began to preach I was very cautious lest I should be misrepresented, and guarded the subject on all sides. I got beyond that point. I found that I got on better when, without regard to consequences, I threw myself upon the hearts and consciences of my hearers. In those early days of my pastoral experience I saw how men reasoned themselves into skepticism. I knew what it was to have 100 nights poured into 1 hour. I remember one infidel book in the possession of my student companion. He said, "DeWitt, would you like to read that book?" "Well," said I would like to look at it." I read it a little while. I said to him, "I dare not read that book, you had better destroy it. I give you my advice, you had better destroy it. I dare not read that book, I have read enough of it." "Oh," he said, "haven't you a stronger mind than that? Can't you read a book you don't exactly believe and not be affected by it?" I said, "You had better destroy it." He kept it. He read it until he gave up the Bible, his belief in the existence of a God, his good morals, until body, mind, and soul were ruined, and he went into the insane asylum. I read too much of it. I read about 15 or 20 pages of it. I wish I had never read it. It never did me any good, it did me harm. I have often struggled with what I read in that book. I rejected it, I denounced it, I cast it out with infinite scorn, I hated it. Yet sometimes its caricature of good and its eulogium of evil have troubled me. With supreme gratitude, therefore, I remember the wonderful impression made upon me, when I was a young man, of the presence of a consecrated human being in the pulpit. It was a Sabbath evening in spring at the Trinity United Methodist Church, Jersey City. Reverend William P. Corbett, the pastor of that church, in compliment to my relatives, who attended upon his services, invited me to preach for him. I had only a few months before entered the gospel ministry, and had come in from my village settlement to occupy a place in the pulpit of the great Methodist orator. In much trepidation on my part I entered the church with Mr. Corbett, and sat trembling in the corner of the sacred desk, waiting for the moment to begin the service. A crowded audience had assembled to hear the pastor of that church preach, and the disappointment I was about to create added to my embarrassment. The service opened, and the time came to offer the prayer before the sermon. I turned to Mr. Corbett and said, "I wish you would lead in prayer." He replied, "No, sharpen your own knife." The whole occasion was to me memorable for its agitations. But there began an acquaintanceship that became more and more endearing and ardent as the years went by. After he ceased, through the coming on of the infirmities of age, to occupy a pulpit of his own, he frequented my church on the Sabbaths and our prayer meetings during the week. He was the most powerful exhorter I ever heard. Whatever might be the intensity of interest in a revival service, he would in a 10-minute address augment it. I never heard him deliver a sermon except on 2 occasions, and those during my boyhood, but they made lasting impressions upon me. I do not remember the texts or the ideas, but they demonstrated the tremendous reality of spiritual and eternal things, and showed possibilities in religious address that I had never known or imagined. He was so unique in manners, in pulpit oratory, and in the entire type of his nature, that no one will ever be able to describe what he was. Those who saw and heard him the last 10 or 15 years of his decadence can have no idea of his former power as a preacher of the gospel. There he is, as I first saw him, eye like a hawk's, hair long and straight as a Chippewa Indian's. He was not straight as an arrow, for that suggests something too fragile and short, but more like a column, not only straight, but tall and majestic, and capable of holding any weight without fatigue or exertion. When he put his foot down, either literally or figuratively, it was down. Vacillation or fear or incertitude or decision were strangers to whom he would never be introduced. When he entered a room you were, to use a New Testament phrase, exceedingly filled with his company. He was as affectionate as a woman to those whom he liked, and cold as Greenland to those whose principles were an affront. He was not only a mighty speaker, but a mighty listener. I do not know how any man could speak upon any important theme standing in his presence without being set on fire by his alert sympathy. But he has vanished from mortal sight. What the resurrection will do for him I cannot say. If those who have only ordinary stature and unimpressive physique in this world are at the last to have bodies resplendent and of supernal potency, what will the unusual corporeity of William P. Corbett become? In his case, the resurrection will have unusual material to start with. If a sculptor can mold a handsome form out of clay, what can he not put out of Parian marble? If the blast of the trumpet which wakes the dead rouses lifelong invalidism and emaciation into athletic celestialism, what will be the transfiguration when the sound of the final reanimation touches the ears of those sleeping giants among the trees and fountains of greenwood? Good-bye, great and good and splendid soul. Good-bye till we meet again. I will look around for you as soon as I come, if through the pardoning grace of Christ I am so happy as to reach the place of your destination. Meet me at the gate of the city, or under the tree of life on the bank of the river, or just inside of the door of the house of many mansions, or in the hall of the temple which has no need of stellar or lunar or solar illumination, for the Lamb is the light thereof. After 3 years of grace and happiness at Belleville, I accepted a call to a church in Syracuse. My pastorate there, in the very midst of its most uplifting crisis, was interrupted, as I believe, by divine orders. The ordeal of deciding anything important in my life has always been a desperate period of anxiety. I have never really decided for myself. God has told me what to do. The first great crisis of this sort came to me in Syracuse. While living there, I received a pastoral call from the Second Reformed Church of Philadelphia. 6 weeks of agony followed. I was about 30 years of age. The thick shock of hair with which I had been supplied in those 6 weeks was thinned out to its present scarcity. My church in Syracuse was made up of as delightful people as ever came together, but I felt that the climate of Philadelphia would be better adapted to my health, and so I was very anxious to go. But a recent revival in my Syracuse church, and a movement at that time on foot for extensive repairs of our building, made the question of my leaving for another pastorate very doubtful. 6 weeks of sleeplessness followed. Every morning I combed out handfuls of hair as the result of the nervous agitation. Then I decided to stay, and never expected to leave those kind parishioners of Syracuse. A year afterward the call from Philadelphia was repeated, and all the circumstances having changed, I went. But I learned during those 6 weeks of uncertainty about going from Syracuse to Philadelphia a lesson I shall never forget, and a lesson that might be useful to others in like crisis. Namely, that it is one's duty to stay where you are until God makes it evident that you should move. In all my life I never had one streak of good luck, but I have had a good God watching and guiding me. While I was living in Syracuse I delivered my first lecture. It was a literary lecture. My ideas of a literary lecture are very much changed from what they used to be. I used to think that a lecture ought to be something very profound. I began with 3 or 4 lectures of that kind in stock. My first lecture audience was in a patient community of the town of Hudson, New York. All my addresses previously had been literary. I had made speeches on literature and patriotism, and sometimes filled the gaps when in lecture courses speakers announced failed to arrive. But the first paid lecture was at Hudson. The $50 which I received for it seemed immense. Indeed, it was the extreme price paid anyone in those days. It was some years later in life that I got into the lecturing field. It was always, however, subordinate to my chief work of preaching the gospel. Syracuse in 1859 was the West. I felt there all the influences that are now Western. Now there is no West left. They have chased it into the Pacific Ocean. In 1862 I accepted a call to the Second Reformed Church of Philadelphia. What remembrances come to me, looking back to this period of our terrific national carnalism! I shall never forget the first time I saw Abraham Lincoln. We followed into his room at the White House a committee that had come to Washington to tell the President how to conduct the war. The saddest looking man I ever saw was Abraham Lincoln. He had a faraway look while he stood listening to an address being made to him by one of the committee, as though beyond and far and wide he could see the battlefields and hospitals and conflagrations of national bereavement. One of our party asked for his autograph. He cheerfully gave it, asking, "Is that all I can do for you?" He was at that time the most abused man in America. I remember the alarm in Philadelphia when General Lee's army invaded Pennsylvania. Merchants sent their goods quietly to New York. Residents hid their valuables. A request for arms was made at the arsenals, and military companies were organized. Preachers appealed to the men in their congregations, organized companies, engaged a drill sergeant, and carried on daily drills in the yards adjoining their churches. In the regiment I joined for a short time there were many clergymen. It was the most awkward squad of men ever got together. We drilled a week or two, and then disbanded. Whether General Lee heard of the formation of our regiment or not I cannot say, but he immediately retreated across the Potomac. There were in Philadelphia and its vicinity many camps of prisoners of war, hospitals for the sick and wounded. Wagon trails of supplies for the soldiers were constantly passing through the streets. I was privileged to be of some service in the field to the Christian Commission. With Dr. Brainerd and Samuel B. Falls I often performed some duty at the cooper shop, while with George H. Stewart and George T. Merigens I invited other cities to make appeals for money to forward the great work of the Secretary and Christian Commissions. In our churches we were constantly busy getting up entertainments and fairs to help those rendered destitute by the loss of fathers and brothers in the field. Just before the Battle of Gettysburg a long procession of clergymen, headed by Dr. Brainerd, marched to Fairmount Park with spades over their shoulders to throw up entrenchments. The victory of the Federal troops at Vicksburg and Gettysburg rendered those earthworks unnecessary. A distinguished gentleman of the Civil War told me that Abraham Lincoln proposed to avoid our civil conflict by purchasing the slaves of the South and setting them free. He calculated what would be a reasonable price for them, and when the number of millions of dollars that would be required for such a purpose was announced, the proposition was scouted, and the North would not have made the offer, and the South would not have accepted it if made. But, said my military friend, the war went on, and just the number of $1,000,000 that Mr. Lincoln calculated would have been enough to make a reasonable purchase of all the slaves were spent in war, besides all the precious lives that were hurled away in 250 battles. There ought to be some other way for men to settle their controversies without wholesale butchering. It was due partly to the national gloom that overspread the people during the Civil War that I took to the lecture platform actively. I entered fully into the lecturing field when I went to Philadelphia, where DeWitt Moore, officer in my church and a most intimate friend, asked me to lecture for the benefit of a ball club to which he belonged. That lecture, in a hall in Locust Street, Philadelphia, opened the way for more than I could do as a lecturer. I have always made such engagements subordinate to my chief work of preaching the gospel. Excepting 2 long journeys a year, causing each an absence of 2 Sundays, I have taken no lecturing engagements except one a week, generally Thursdays. Lecturing has saved my life and prolonged my work. It has taken me from an ever-ringing door-bell and freshened me for work, railroad traveling being to me a recuperation. I have lectured in nearly all the cities of the United States, Canada, England, Ireland, and Scotland, and in most of them many times. The prices paid me have seemed too large, but my arrangements have generally been made through bureaus, and almost invariably local committees have cleared money. The lecture platform seemed to me to offer greater opportunity for usefulness. Things that could not be said in the pulpit, but which ought to have been said, may be said on the Lyceum platform. And there was so much that had to be said then, to encourage, to cheer, to brighten, to illumine the sorrow and bereavement. From the first I regarded my lecture tours as an annex to my church. The lecture platform has been to me a pastoral visitation. It has given me an opportunity of meeting hundreds of thousands of people to whom, through the press, I have for many years administered the gospel. People have often asked me how much money I received for my lectures. The amounts have been a great surprise to me, often. For many years I have been paid from $400 to $1,000 a lecture. The longer the journey the bigger the fee, usually. The average remuneration was about $500 a night. In Cleveland and in Cincinnati I received $750. In Chicago $1,000. Later I was offered $6,000 for 6 lectures in Chicago to be delivered one a month during the World's Fair, but I declined them. My expenses in many directions have been enormous, and without a large income for lectures I could not have done many things which I felt it important to do. I have always been under obligation to the press. Sometimes it has not intended to help me, but it has, being hard pressed for news. During the Civil War, when news was sufficiently exciting for the most ambitious journalist, they used to come to my church for a copy of my sermons. News in those days was pretty accurate, but sometimes it went wrong. On a Sabbath night, at the close of a preaching service in Philadelphia, a reporter of one of the prominent newspapers came into my study adjoining the pulpit and asked of me a sketch of the sermon just delivered, as he had been sent to take it, but had been unavoidably detained. His mind did not seem to be very clear, but I dictated to him about a column of my sermon. He had during the afternoon or evening been attending a meeting of the Christian Commission for raising funds for the hospitals, and ex-Governor Pollock had been making a speech. The reporter had that speech of the ex-Governor of Pennsylvania in his hand, and had the sketch of my sermon in the same bundle of reportorial notes. He opened the door to depart, and said, "Good evening," and I responded, "Good evening." The way out from my study to the street was through a dark alley across which a pump handle projected to an unreasonable extent. "Look out for that pump handle," I said, "or you may get hurt." But the warning did not come soon enough. I heard the collision, and then a hard fall, and a rustle of papers, and a scramble, and then some words of objurgation at the sudden overthrow. There was no portable light I could take to his assistance. Beside that, I was as much upset with cruel laughter as the reporter had been by the pump handle. In this state of helplessness I shut the door. But the next morning newspaper proved how utter had been the discomfiture and demoralization of my journalistic friend. He put my sermon under the name of Governor X. Pollock at the meeting of the Christian Commission, and he made my discourse begin with the words, "When I was Governor of Pennsylvania." Never since John Gutenberg invented the art of printing was there such a riot of types, or such mixing up of occasions. Philadelphia went into a brown study as to what it all meant, and the more the people read of ex-Governor Pollock's speech and of my sermon the night before, the more they were stunned by the stroke of that pump handle. But it was soon forgotten. Everything is. The memory of man is poor. All the talk about the country never forgetting those who fought for it is an untruth. It does not forget. Picture how veterans of the war sometimes had to turn the hand organs on the street of Philadelphia to get a living for their families. How ruthlessly many of them have been turned out of office that some bloat of a politician might take their place. The fact is, there is not a man or woman under 30 years of age who, born before the war, has any full appreciation of the 4 years of martyrdom of 1861 to 1865 inclusive. I can scarcely remember, and yet I still feel the pressure of domestic calamity that overshadowed the nation then. Since things have been hardened, as was the guardsman in the Crimean War who heartlessly wrote home to his mother, I do not want to see any more crying letters come to the Crimea from you. Those I have received I have put into my rifle, and after loading it have fired them at the Russians, because you appear to have a strong dislike of them. If you had seen as many killed as I have, you would not have as many weak ideas as you now have. After the war came a period of great national rejoicing. I shall never forget, in the summer of 1869, a great national peace jubilee was held in Boston, and DeWitt Moore, an elder of my church, had been honored by the selection of some of his music to be rendered on that occasion. I accompanied him to the jubilee. 40,000 people sat and stood in the great Coliseum erected for that purpose. Thousands of wind and stringed instruments, 12,000 trained voices. The masterpieces of all ages rendered, hour after hour and day after day. Handel's Judas Maccabeus, Spohr's Last Judgment, Beethoven's Mount of Olives, Haydn's Creation, Mendelssohn's Elijah, Meyerbeer's Coronation March, rolling on and up in surges that billowed against the heavens. The mighty cadences within were accompanied on the outside by the ringing of the bells of the city, and cannon on the common, in exact time with the music, discharged by electricity, thundering their awful bars of a harmony that astounded all nations. Sometimes I bowed my head and wept. Sometimes I stood up in the enchantment, and sometimes the effect was so overpowering I felt I could not endure it. When all the voices were in full chorus, and all the batons in full wave, and all the orchestra in full triumph, and 100 anvils under mighty hammers were in full clang, and all the towers of the city rolled in their majestic sweetness, and the whole building quaked with the boom of 30 cannon, Parappa Rosa, with a voice that will never again be equaled on earth until the archangelic voice proclaims that time shall be no longer, rose above all other sounds in her rendering of our national air, the Star-Spangled Banner. It was too much for a mortal and quite enough for an immortal to hear. And while some fainted, one womanly spirit, released under its power, sped away to be with God. It was a marvel of human emotion in patriotic frenzy. Immediately following the Civil War there was a great wave of intemperance, and bribery swept over our land. The temptation to intemperance in public places grew more and more terrific. Of the men who were prominent in political circles, but few died respectably. The majority among them died of delirium tremens. The doctor usually fixed up the case for the newspapers, and in his report told them it was usually gout or rheumatism or obstruction of the liver or exhaustion from patriotic services, but we all knew it was whiskey. That which smote the villain in the dark alley smote down the great orator and the great legislator. The one you wrapped in a rough cloth, and pushed into a rough coffin, and carried out in a box wagon, and let him down into a pauper's grave without a prayer or benediction. Around the other gathered the pomp of the land, and lordly men walked with uncovered heads beside the hearse, tossing with plumes on the way to a grave to be adorned with a white marble shaft, all four sides covered with eulogium. The one man was killed by logwood rum at 2 cents a glass, the other by a beverage $3 a bottle. I write both their epitaphs. I write the one epitaph with my lead pencil on the shingle over the pauper's grave. I write the other epitaph with a chisel, cutting on the white marble of the senator, slain by strong drink. The time came when dissipation was no longer a hindrance to office in this country. Did we not at one time have a Secretary of the United States carried home dead drunk? Did we not have a Vice President sworn in so intoxicated that the whole land hid its head in shame? Judges and jurors and attorneys sometimes tried important cases by day, and by night caroused together in iniquity. During the war, whiskey had done its share in degrading manhood. What was it that defeated the armies sometimes in the late war? Drunkenness in the saddle. What mean those graves on the heights of Fredericksburg? As you go to Richmond you see them. Drunkenness in the saddle. In place of the bloodshed of war came the deformations of character, libertinism. Again and again it was demonstrated that impurity walked under the chandeliers of the mansion and dozed on damask upholstery. In Albany, in Harrisburg, in Trenton, in Washington, intemperance was rife in public places. The two political parties remained silent on the question. Hand in hand with intemperance went the crime of bribery by money, by proffered office. For many years after the war had been almost forgotten, in many of the legislatures it was impossible to get a bill through unless it had financial consideration. The question was asked softly, sometimes very softly, in regard to a bill, "Is there any money in it?" And the lobbies of the legislatures and the national capital were crowded with railroad men and manufacturers and contractors. The iniquity became so great that sometimes reformers and philanthropists have been laughed out of Harrisburg and Albany and Trenton and Washington, because they came empty-handed. You vote for this bill and I'll vote for that bill. You favor that monopoly of a moneyed institution and I'll favor the other monopoly of another institution. And here's a bill that is going to be very hard to get through the legislature, and some friends met together at a midnight banquet, and while intoxicated promised to vote the same way. Here are $5,000 for prudent distribution in this direction, and here are $1,000 for prudent distribution in that direction. Now we are within 4 votes of having enough. $5,000 to that intelligent member from Westchester, and $2,000 to that stupid member from Ulster, and now we are within 2 votes of having it. Give $500 to this member who will be sick and stay at home, and $300 to this member who will go to see his great aunt languishing in her last sickness. The day has come for the passing of the bill. The Speaker's gavel strikes. Senators, are you ready for the question? All in favor of voting away these thousands of millions of dollars will say aye. Aye, 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 aye. The ayes have it. It was a merciful thing that all this corruption went on under a Republican form of government. Any other style of government would have been consumed by it long ago. There were enough national swindles enacted in this country after the war, yes, 30 years afterwards, to swamp 3 monarchies. The Democratic party filled its cup of iniquity as it went out of power before the war. Then the Republican party came along and filled its cup of iniquity a little sooner, and there they lie, the Democratic party and the Republican party, side by side, great loathsome carcasses of iniquity, each one worse than the other. These are the reminiscences of more than 30 years ago, and yet it seems that I have never ceased to fight the same sort of human temptations and frailties to this very day. Section 5